Thank you. It's so wonderful to be here, see so many familiar faces, and I'm looking in the audience, and I got to tell you, look at Jim Krimmel. He is one of the he has not changed in 40 years. No gray, no wrinkles. Jim, I'm not sure what the secret is, but you look just the same, and I'm looking at some other folks here in the room. I see Rick Lafredo here, and I don't know if Deb wants to hear this, but the only thing I remember about Rick is we missed a lot of classes together, so, so that I remember distinctly. And, I see George Palmer here, and George is chair of the board here. And, I first met George back in 1988. George, I don't even know if you remember, Linglestown Road. And what I remember about George is even then, he was just beating the crap out of me for a few extra basis points on a CD, if you remember that. So, George, it's 2%. No, what about 210? So that's how we got started, if you remember that. Glad to see Barry here, and it brings a lot of emotions back. And I just want to, and I'll talk a little bit about Barry, because Barry and Bev, I came to Messiah as an international student, 17 years old, never been west of Cairo, and so I did not know what the Western world looked like, because, in those days we didn't have YouTube and internet and all that. So what you saw was, we had TV reception from 5 to 10 p.m., but nothing live, and everything we saw was about the British, nothing about the U.S., etc. But, when I walked into Miller Dorm, I thought I had gone to heaven, at that time, and added to that was, here come Barry and Bev, who were newlyweds, and he was the first one official member of Messiah to greet me when I came as a freshman with a little suitcase, brown shiny shoes, corduroy pants. They were in those days, So, so Barry, it's nice to see you here, So just a few things, first of all, I want to answer some questions people always have about me. Where are you from, Andrew? So I'll just share a little bit. I'm of Indian origin. I grew up in India, lived there for my first 6 years, and came from a very poor background. And I often describe, if you've ever seen Slumdog Millionaire, in the beginning of the movie, you see the two little boys walking with cans of water. Anybody remember that scene? Okay, that's me. That's me and my cousins. We grew up in a very poor environment. I'll just share one example, because at that time, the entrepreneurial spirit was really laid on me early, and God has mysterious ways in which He places things on your heart and training, etc. But when I was probably about 5 years old, one of our routine was there were 16 of us that lived in a room that was maybe 14 by 14, and we slept there, we ate there, we cooked there. So in the mornings, we would get up and put everything to the side, and that's where my mom and her sisters would cook over an open fire, and then they'd get rid of that in the evenings when we laid down to sleep. But one of the things that was very important was we wanted to find ways to make money to eat that day, and one of the things we used to do was actually follow cattle in India, and most of you know cows are sacred in India, so there's plenty of them roaming around. And one of our favorite things was to make money was really we would follow these cows around and actually collect fresh cow dung by following these cows, and we would bring it back home, and we would actually then make sort of cow dung patties out of them. We would actually sell it to neighbors, etc. Because in those days, the conditions we lived in, for example, cow dung, most of you may not realize, but instead of a dirt floor, a cow dung floor is much better, because a dirt floor, the dust rises, etc. But if you take fresh cow dung and kind of smear it over the floor, it kind of, when it dries, it seals the dust. Okay, and it's a much better surface to lay on, sit on, etc. Now you may think, I will tell you, cow dung does not stink. Okay, so there's no smell with it. But so we would collect that so people could buy from us. The cow dung patties, we had open fires. We didn't have much in terms of firewood around, but the cow dung patties burned really well. So we would sell those patties to our neighbors, etc. And that was one of the ways we raised money. But, I look back now and I just say, God in his own faithfulness was planting seeds of entrepreneurism in me at that time, because, it was a creative way of trying to generate income for us. So I am from India. That was my background. My dad was fortunate. He got a job in Zambia, Africa. So we moved there when I was 6 years old. And Zambia was very interesting for us. For us, it was, my dad just packed up with the 4 children, got on a plane, and we landed in Zambia, and he took a job there in the military. So I spent the next 11 years in Zambia going to high school there. I knew I wanted to go to a Christian college, so when I was ready to graduate, one of the issues I had was, my dad made $3,000 a year at that time, so I was very limited in terms of opportunities. And at that time, the Russians and the Cubans, because it was around 1979-80, the Cold War was still alive, they were recruiting in Zambia for students, where they would provide fully paid boarding and school, etc. And you could go to school in Cuba or Russia, but in exchange, you had to spend some time in their communist indoctrination. And so I had an opportunity to actually go to Cuba to go to medical school, but instead I chose to come to Messiah. So how did that happen? That was one alternative. But while I was doing this, I was attending the Northmead Assembly of God Church, and one of my neighbors, Kurt Nisley, was a former professor here at Messiah. And so he's the first person that introduced me to the concept of Messiah. His brother-in-law happened to be Ron Long, who was the admissions director here. And so he said, you ought to look at Messiah, and I did. And the problem was we had 2 issues. One was finances. Told you my father was making $3,000 a year. Tuition at that time was $4,000 a year at Messiah. That equation, even for non-bankers, does not work. So I knew I had a problem there. But Messiah was kind, and that's why I'm eternally grateful to Messiah College, because they said, listen, get yourself here, and we will make sure that through work study and summer programs, etc., that we'll make sure that you're able to afford an education here. But I also needed a sponsor, and I was fortunate that a family in Mountjoy who had 4 daughters stepped up, Wilbur and Lois Hess, and they stepped up and said, listen, come on over and we'll sponsor you for 6 months to get into the country, but then you've got to find your own sponsor. So those 2 things kind of allowed me to come to Messiah, and that's when I showed up when I was 17. People have asked me about how long I've been a Christian, and Christianity has been part of our family for generations. My first name is Andrew because it was my grandmother's favorite disciple, and my last name is Samuel because one of my forefathers' favorite prophet was Samuel. So when he became a Christian, he adopted Samuel as his last name, and so that's how it's been in the family. So Christianity has been in our family generations. My grandfather actually, in the colonial days, which was in the 30s and 40s, actually would travel around India with British missionaries, and my grandfather knew 5 languages, and the British would preach in English, and they would be on a carriage, horse-drawn carriage. The British would preach in English, and my grandfather would actually translate in whatever the local language was, because in India there's many, many languages depending on what region you're in. And so when the British, when India got its independence, the British left, most of their missionaries left, and so they turned over the ministry activities to my grandfather. And so Christianity has been in our family a long time. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to come to Messiah, because I wanted a Christian education. That was the driving force. So anyway, I got to Messiah. I met this girl that, and we went to our first date, which was a Randy Stonehill and Larry Norman concert. If anybody remembers that, and so we went to this concert, and I met this girl who became a good friend. And as you remember, the family in Mount Joy said I needed to find a sponsor after the first 6 months. Her parents offered to be my sponsors. I went to the family in Mount Joy, said, listen, I found new sponsors. And they said, nah, we kind of like you, so we'll just stay as your sponsors, Lo and behold, that girl became my wife, and we have known each other 39 years. Been married 35 years, have 5 children, 10 grandchildren, soon to be 12. And so, God has been wonderful in how faithfully He has steered my life, not only in India, but Africa, and then here. So I know today's topic is the common good, and I want to talk a little bit about things that have impacted me during my career. Early on, I started my career with Commonwealth National Bank in Harrisburg, and I remember going to the office at the square where the Dauphin County offices are now. That's where we were headquartered. And everybody in the bank would look at me and say, you went to Messiah. Shouldn't you be in ministry or a pastor or something? What are you doing here in banking, Because in those days, everybody perceived that if you graduated from Messiah, you were headed into ministry. And of course, that has changed dramatically thanks to our alumni who have just made a tremendous impact in the community from a business and finance perspective. So that's where I started. But my first experience and introduction to the common good was I was asked to be a loan exec with the United Way of Capital Region. And a loan exec was every company in the area at that time. One of the things they did was they would offer an FTE as a volunteer to the United Way to help with their campaign. This was usually in August, September, and you got involved in the campaign that went 3 months where you helped raise money from the community to take care of the community. And I thought it was an interesting concept because when I got to the United Way, I couldn't believe that people would actually give money for good causes in the area and not expect anything back in return, but that the money was actually going to non-family members, Because growing up in India and even in Zambia, that's a foreign concept because people work and you take care of your immediate family and your extended family, but you don't give to causes that are not related to you from a blood perspective, So for me, it was a real interesting concept, but it just was intriguing for me to think that I was part of something where we would go out to businesses and ask them to contribute, we'd ask their employees to contribute, and we would raise this money. Then that money would be circulated into our community, into different organizations and causes. And that was my first introduction to say, what a way to impact the community. And it was shortly after that God laid on my heart, which has been sort of the mantra that I've always lived by, is that my purpose here is to impact people's lives positively. And that means it's not about customers, it's not about making money or anything, it's just simply impact people's lives in this environment, And so as soon as I got to a point where I had leadership roles where I could begin to influence the direction of the company, we always talked about what is our great purpose, because every great company has to have a fundamental purpose that's bigger than making money. You're going to make money, but you've got to have a purpose that's beyond just making money. And for me, it was to impact people's lives positively. And in the banking business, I tell our people all the time, look, we want to make sure that the FedEx or the UPS guy that drops off the package every day at our offices, walks away and says, this is by far my favorite place to come, because when I come here, you guys pick me up, I walk away with a smile, I feel good, you give me a cup of coffee, etc. It's not to make him a customer. but to impact his life so that he walks away and that night when he goes home, he doesn't kick the dog because he's so happy you've treated him well, etc. Because it becomes contagious, and so impacting everybody we touch. Now, I also tell our people, guess what? You do that enough, that FedEx and UPS guy, ultimately, if you ask him, do you want to be a customer? There's no way he's going to say no. If you've had that kind of an impact, they're not going to say no, So the model has to be, what is that fundamental purpose that drives your organization? And if you rally everybody around that purpose, that drives everything, So for me, it started as a result of that experience with the United Way. And then every company I've been at, it's been about pursuing that purpose, of impacting people's lives, To give you another example, so somebody mentioned, we had a great company, Greystone Tower Bank. We merged with Susquehanna, and the idea was that we had a bigger platform to impact people's lives. And I can tell you that was what we were trying to do in this merged company, But pretty soon it was obvious that everything at Susquehanna, and I don't mind talking about that openly now because they're no longer here, so I can't, but was about making money, how to squeeze out the next dollar. And, as I try to shift through the idea of, wait a minute, we've got to have a greater purpose than just making a few bucks. Yes, shareholders are important. Yes, customers are important. Yes, employees are important. The community is important. But you can't just hone in on making money. You've got to do good things, And when I felt like there was a conflict, God stirred up my heart to say, there is a conflict here. This is not what I want for your life. What are you going to do about it? And that's what led me to move to Florida to be part of a small bank down there. And God just stirred up my heart and said, this is where I want you because you are not living out the purpose that I placed in your heart at Susquehanna. And that's what we did. So at Sunshine, we wanted to make an impact on the community, which is we quickly made an impact on that community. People have asked me, why would you go to Florida? You don't know anybody there. You don't know the market. There's 5 million people in the Tampa area. And how are you going to do this? And, my answer to people was always, listen, if our purpose is pure and honors God, God's favor is with me. And so I have no doubt we're going to be successful in Florida because we know our purpose is pure and God's going to honor that. And that's what he did. He honored what we did there. We sold that company, and one of the things we learned in Florida was that we live in a great community. South Central Pennsylvania is a great community to raise kids. I mean, if you look around here, the season, don't take the seasons for granted. The mountains, the rivers, the fishing, the hunting, all of these things. This is home. And there's something about Central Pennsylvania where you build strong relationships, you build deep relationships, you build intimate relationships. Not every community in our country can you do that, And so there's something special about this. And that's why we wanted to create LINKBANK. And we created LINKBANK about 6 months ago, and I'll turn it over to Brent here to talk about the future. But LINKBANK was created with two things that I was interested in. Don't get me wrong, LINKBANK is a privately held company with investors. We are going to make money. We have to make money for our investors, our employees, etc. But again, that can't be the purpose. You will make money, but you've got to have a greater purpose. For me, two things that are driving the creation of LINKBANK is one, I realize what an important community Central Pennsylvania is, and we want to give back to this community. We want to grow the community. So one of our goals is for LINKBANK to grow, to be profitable, so that we have more resources to give back to the community in enriching our Central Pennsylvania marketplace. And so that's always on my mind. We try to get our employees to rally around that, to say, look, why are you making an extra sales call? Why are you working later? It's not to make more money, but it is so that we can enrich the communities. And one of the ways to do that is to grow and make more money so that we can give back to the community. So that's a big criteria. A lot of our investors fully understand that we've created a foundation that will be funded by the bank that will help meet the needs of our community. So that's one major issue. The second is, I'm 56 years old. I'm still young, but I also know that the energy level and what I want to accomplish. There's a time frame there, and I would love to develop the next generation of leaders that believe in the values of impacting people's lives positively, honesty, integrity, doing the right things, etc. And we have a very, very young group of people at the bank, young leaders, and I'm just thrilled about being able to pour those values into them so that the next generation of leaders can step up and build companies that want to have a positive impact on the communities. Those are really the two driving forces for me. And you might say, well, what about the financial? Well, if these two things happen, trust me, the financial part will take care of itself, So that's what we've kind of built our company around. So Brent, if you don't mind just sharing where we're headed with this as we go forward. So we will have time for a few Q&A, so.
Yeah,
any questions? Yes, Jay?
What do you do differently in your recruiting and interview process to ensure that you get people that are going to align with your mission?
Jay's question was, what do you do different in terms of recruiting employees? So first of all, at LINKBANK, we've been fortunate. We haven't had to recruit because it's all been word of mouth, and a lot of people that are with us now have worked with us before. Some have just joined us, but they knew of us, they knew the values, so they've kind of joined us from that perspective. But I can tell you, previously at other banks, the process has always been, we have a pretty extensive interview process that we go through, and we always said, look, the HR has to interview them, obviously the hiring manager, their manager, but then we also had another component. We always had what we called a culture team headed by a chief culture officer, and the culture team always had to interview also, and to a certain degree they had the final say in terms of, is this a good cultural fit? All the others were interviewing more based on HR from an employment perspective, etc. The two managers more about the skill sets, but the culture folks, it was more about, does this person meet our values? And so it was a pretty extensive process that they would go through in those scenarios. And that's what will happen as we go forward. But the beauty of building a great company with a great purpose is that you rarely have to go recruit, because people seek you out because they believe in your values and they want to be part of that. So great question. Anybody else? Well, we must have been pretty thorough. Yes. Yes, Justin.
Is there any story or significance behind the name?
The name.
LINKBANK.
Do you want to take that one?
Sure, I can take that one. So it's got multiple meanings. For me, I think, the biggest thing when we think about linking, and the community, everybody has a story. We're not the beginning or the end of any business's story. But, when you think about it as a chain, we can play a part and we can be a link. And we want to be the best link that we can be in there and make it better than another bank that you might place in there. So, how do we link things together? Again, we're not the beginning, we're not the end of anybody's story, but we play a part in that chain, and how do we do that well? That's part of the link. Some of it is, technology. We're driven toward a different model. It's not bricks and mortar driven, but it's technology driven. So there's multiple, but for us, it's more about relationships. How do we link people together? And then how do we link, somebody's journey into a better place of success as a business than maybe they were before they met us. So.
Yes.
With your clients, I'm sure that maybe you don't always offer the lowest rate and those
Right.
types of things, so it's a very competitive market.
Right.
So the part of you that wants to add value, how much do they grasp that, and how much do they value that?
Mm-hmm.
Does it seem intangible to them?
Right. The question is, it's a very competitive business, banking, and how do you convince a client that you're adding value to the equation beyond just the best rate or the best pricing? And it's an interesting thing that comes up all the time, because it is an intangible, and I think one of the things that we try to do in that process is, a lot of times bankers will actually sit down with somebody and say, well, here are the terms, the rates, etc. What we try to do is to say, look, let's put all that aside. Let's talk about what your company is trying to accomplish, where you're going, and then we'll share with you what we're about and where we're headed, and let's see if there's a fit. Because the other stuff in terms of the rates and things like that, we can deal with, but we got to make sure that there's a fit here where we can bring value to the table. Do all customers buy into that? No, but a lot of family-owned businesses, want that kind of interaction, want to build that kind of value with a partner that is like-minded, so, okay. Hey.
That's a great question. I tell our team all the time, we want to spend about 5 to 10 minutes on the actual banking piece, and we want to spend the rest of our time with the client talking about who they are, what they are, our values, how those align. Because if that's where we're at, we can figure the transaction piece out. That's the easy part. It's are we aligned, and do people see the value of us joining together at the end of the day? So.
Yes.
Question about banking is very merger acquisition
Mm-hmm.
from my perspective. How do you see, has that been an issue as a young company, and how, as you grow, if that's part of the strategy, how do you ensure that your values really get immersed in that acquired piece of your business?
Yeah. So the question is, in the day, in the age of mergers and acquisitions in the banking industry, how does that impact us, and how do we view that as we go forward? Brent talked about the 5 constituents that we focus on, and it's interesting. All 5 don't have the same agenda. You know what I mean? So it starts with our employees, because great employees that are passionate, engaged, bring more customers to the table. And if customers are happy, our investors are happy. And if investors are happy, there's more resources to go into the community. And so you're investing in the community. And then the final piece is the regulators are happy too, And so, when you look at that environment, there's never been a company where we've gone in with the end game being, we want to merge or we want to sell, anything like that. It's always been, look, we want to create value for all these constituents, and how do we do that? And as long as we continue to build that value, we can keep that group happy. I will tell you, I've never been hesitant to sell a company if I thought it was the right thing for our 5 constituents, you know what I mean? And in some cases, at the time we made the decision, it was the right decision. And then a few years later, maybe some of those parties, it wasn't the right decision, you know what I mean? But you deal with the facts that you have and the external environment, internal environment, but it's always been driven around making sure those 5 constituents are the ones that you're focused on, so, okay. There was one more. Ray.
Andrew and Brent, thanks for your presentation. I'd love to hear, where do you draw your inspiration from, each of you, maybe who are your role models?
Okay. The question from Ray is, who are our role models, And I don't know if you want to start. Okay. To me, everything is about kingdom building, And so, to me, when I think about the greatest leader, Jesus. You know what I mean? The person, Jesus. Everything is about building kingdom, and that's where I draw a lot of inspiration from, And to me, building a great company that's successful is kingdom building activity. To me, it just happens to be banking. There was a time I thought, growing up in 3 different cultures, having a finance background, I'm the perfect candidate to be a missionary in Africa or India or something. But the reality was, what God laid on my heart was, there's a mission field right here in central Pennsylvania. There's kingdom building work to be done right here. And so I felt like, I happen to be in banking, but it really all is about kingdom building. But that would be my answer, is that I draw a lot of inspiration from when I look at Jesus' life, his ability to build relationship, his ability to impact people, just everything you do as a leader, etc. That's where I get the inspirations. Brent?
Yeah, I would echo that, but also for me, my early, coming out of Messiah, I thought that, how do I get the next raise? How do I get the next title? Like that, that was just, because in business, oftentimes, if you're taking that next step, that means you're being successful. You were successful in the last step, so you go to the next one. And I chased that for a while, and I don't quite know where that motivation came from, because faith's been important to me, and I would say it was important then, but it was probably a misguided, view on the world and what success looked like. So, that's kind of changed. I think having kids change you in some way. So I would say an inspiration for me is a 7 and 9-year-old who, you try and find a meaningful way to live out your passion and have them see that, but teach them good things in stewardship of time and money and all the things that I was taught by my parents. So how do we do that well? I think that's my inspiration every day, is hopefully that, how do we live that out well and represent that, within a family unit, which is, when you look around, for better or worse, it's broken family units are what is creating a bit of chaos in our society. So to be able to do that, that's much of my motivation, is how do I do, yes, the banking piece well, and yes, our team well, but how does that also create good things for my family is definitely a big motivator.
I know David's on the left-hand side here, but if there's anybody else,
Getting hooked.
I know, so here we go. Oops, one more question. Doug, is that okay, David?
We'll let it go this time.
Okay. Spoken like a professor.
So you talked a lot about the relationships and understanding common purpose. What effect is the digitization of transactions and relationships, the internet and all that? How do you see that kind of playing out in your strategy and future of banking and what you're trying to do?
Right, I'll let Brent do that because he lives in that age. If I got involved in that, maybe I will make a comment, but go ahead.
We can tell you a story about Andrew's technology, or lack thereof, usage. But yeah, I think, Doug, to be honest and transparent, I think we're still trying to figure that out, because I think banking is a little bit behind the curve in that, when you look at the Amazon and the Uber experience, and you think about banking, even the biggest banks with the most money, you look at the BV and SunTrust merger, that was all about technology. That's about them trying to get scale to do technology well. So technology is, and that's where we've said, the model that was successful in the past for us has to change, and it has to incorporate that. And we're still trying to figure out, how do we interact with clients well? How do clients want to interact with us? How much do they want to be independent? How much do they want to interact with us? I think we're still on a journey on that. The marketing piece of our business is actually the more complicated piece. Is how do you, used to be, you put a CD ad in and there was your rate and people just started walking in the doors and you had a $30 million branch. That just doesn't work anymore. It doesn't, the model's completely broken down. So how do we do that? We know that we have to have good technology to allow people to do their transactions in the way that they want to. We also know that a majority of the clients that choose LINKBANK want to at least know behind that technology who the people are and what they're standing for. Whether they interact with us or not, that's important. That's the kind of the common good piece. But then also know that they can get access to us. So I would say, to be honest, we're still on a journey trying to figure that out. Some of that is the banking world doesn't have the technology today, and we're trying to figure out how do we get there and help kind of be a leader in the marketplace for that. But yeah, I think that's a journey that any business is on right now. How do we, if we want to be value added and less commoditized, and relationships are of value, how do we do that well in this digitized world? Yeah. So maybe you'll speak at that at another one, and I can go back and listen. Because that was a really roundabout question with no good answer.
Shomar, appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Appreciate it.